I, Damart Williams. I'm the Senior Director for Zonal Operations, the Eastern Zone at the Forestry Department. I have responsibilities for all forest operations related activities in the eastern end of the island. That's inclusive of the parish of St. Mary, Portland, St. Thomas, Kingston and St. Andrew, St. Catherine and Clarendon. We have various activities that we carry out as it relates to client services and forest management activities. Forest management, as you can imagine, deals with the overall activities regarding how we manage the forest ecosystems. So we of course go in and we plant trees, we maintain the areas that we plant to ensure that there's some amount of sustainability over the years. As it relates to client services, that's the arm of the branch, or the division rather, that goes out and interfaces with community members, with schools and the general public. There's also another aspect of our activities that relates to community forestry. Our rural sociologist is a person who interfaces mostly with the community groups, forming what we call local forest management committees. Well, there are a number of deleterious impacts or effects that forest fires have on forests. Well, allow me to create some context and background. The vast majority of forest fires that we experience here in Jamaica do not necessarily start within the confines of the forest reserves that we manage. They actually start outside on the lands that are abutting the areas that we manage. So for example, we find that individuals who are slashing and burning lands to commence their planting activities, or for the burning of garbage, or for the pastoral activities, those fires normally start outside and spread by way of wind, or actually sometimes on the ground as well, to the areas that we manage. When we do have these fires in the forest reserves, as I said, their impacts are quite significant and severe. There's a total disruption of the forest ecosystems that takes place when we have these fires. For example, there's a loss of habitat. There are also other economic effects as well. A lot of persons who are residing or operating close to the forest reserves depend heavily on the forest reserves that we manage. So for example, cultivation, even though sometimes that's not necessarily permitted, but persons do go into the forest reserves, they do cultivation, they also do the removal of fruits. There's also a social aspect of it as well, where persons sometimes go into the forest just to enjoy themselves, for peace of mind. And when there's a total loss or significant damage to forest, that no longer is a possibility. So our forests are near and dear to us at Forestry Department, and what we're trying to institute as well in Jamaica is a cultivation of this culture where persons also have this appreciation and love for the forest reserves that we manage. Right. The Forestry Department is governed by two pieces of legislation: the Forest Act of 1996 and the Forest Regulations of 2001. And the law is very explicit as it relates to slash and burn or general burning within the confines of our forest reserves. For example, Section 31, subsection 1C of the Forest Act states that if one kindles, keeps or carries fire within a forest reserve, a forest management area or protected area, then they have committed an offense. And that offense carries with it a maximum of $200,000 or 2 years in prison. So it's either fine or confinement. The alternative legislation, or the subsidiary legislation that we are governed by, is the Forest Regulations, as I said, of 2001. Regulation 13 makes specific reference to the fact that if one kindles or carries an open fire outside of the boundaries of a forest reserve, maximum 1 kilometer, then they too are liable under the Act, or under the regulations rather, for an offense. And the maximum under the forest regulations is $50,000 or 1 year in prison. So what you see with these two pieces of legislation is an attempt by the Forestry Department not just to have certain proscribed activities within the boundaries of the forest reserve, but also outside the forest reserve, because we do recognize that a lot of the fires that are started don't necessarily start within the forest reserves themselves. So if persons outside within a 1 kilometer radius of the forest reserve are carrying out these activities, then they themselves, as I said, are liable under the Act, because their activities in a very, well, sometimes indirect way, cause the massive fires that we have on the forest reserves themselves. Alright, I will go back to 2015. That year was a seminal year as it relates to forest fires. That year we had countless numbers of hectares being either damaged or totally destroyed by forest fires. We have persons who lost millions of dollars in terms of their livelihood, persons who had crops not just on the forest reserves but on their private lands as well. So economically, forest fires have had very significant impacts, not just on individuals but on the government as well, because when we lose, for example, young plantations in the forest reserves, then we have to spend taxpayer dollars to go back to replant some of these areas, making attempts as well to put in what we call fire lines and other preventative measures to protect the lands that we plant. So economically, we have had significant, as I said, impacts on the forest and individuals as well. Well, for one, the effect of their activities sometimes is quite direct. So some persons who believe that by lighting fires, in many cases, don't affect them. Persons need to be cognizant of the fact that when they light fires, sometimes when they have, when they cause fires on forest reserves, then they themselves are affected by, as I said, loss of livelihood, the loss of the forest ecosystems as well, which have direct impact on them in terms of having carbon sequestration taking place, providing oxygen for them as well. So persons need to recognize the fact that forests are there for their benefit, not just for the benefit of persons at Forestry Department. So once we get to instill in persons the idea that forests are there for their use, direct and indirect, then I think we can move past this issue of having these massive fires every year.